When people imagine medieval monks, they often picture silent men in clean brown robes, heads bowed in prayer, living peaceful lives devoted to God. This image, shaped by art and later romantic history, is comforting, but it is deeply incomplete. The real daily existence of many medieval monks was far harsher, dirtier, and more human than the idealized vision suggests. Monasteries were not spotless havens of holiness. They were crowded institutions filled with bodies, sickness, hunger, ambition, boredom, and very often, filth. To understand medieval monks, one must first understand the world they lived in. Medieval Europe was a place without modern sanitation, without germ theory, without running water, soap as we know it, or effective medicine. Monks did not live outside this reality. They were shaped by it. Monasteries were usually built near rivers or forests, not for beauty, but for survival. Water was essential for drinking, cooking, brewing beer, and flushing waste, though flushing is a generous term. Despite later myths, monks did not bathe regularly. Bathing was often viewed with suspicion, associated with vanity or moral weakness. Some religious rules even discouraged frequent washing, believing physical discomfort brought the soul closer to God. Many monks washed only their hands and face, perhaps their feet on special occasions. Full-body bathing might happen a few times a year, if at all. As a result, monasteries were places of strong smells. Unwashed bodies, damp wool robes, smoke from kitchens, rotting food scraps, and human waste. Latrines existed in monasteries, but they were primitive. Often built over flowing water, they allowed waste to drop directly into rivers or moats. In winter, these places were freezing. In summer, they were swarming with flies. Privacy was minimal. Multiple monks sat side by side, robes lifted, in silence or whispered prayer. Cleaning was irregular, and blockages were common. Archaeological evidence shows layers of hardened waste beneath monastery latrines, proving how rarely they were properly maintained. Disease was a constant companion. Fleas, lice, and mites lived in monks' clothing and bedding. Hair shirts, rough garments worn to punish the flesh, were rarely cleaned, making them ideal homes for parasites. Skin infections, rashes, and open sores were widespread. Tooth decay was severe. Monks consumed large amounts of bread and beer, but dental care was non-existent. Many monks suffered chronic pain, infections, and slow deaths that were accepted as spiritual trials rather than medical problems. Food, though more reliable than that of peasants, was not always clean or safe. Monks ate simple meals: bread, porridge, vegetables, cheese, and occasionally fish or meat, depending on the rule of the order. Food storage was poor. Grain could mold. Meat spoiled quickly. Rats and insects were common in kitchens and pantries. Monks often drank weak beer or ale, not for pleasure, but because water was unsafe. Even so, food poisoning was frequent, and mass illness could sweep through a monastery within days. Yet filth was not only physical, it was also moral and institutional. While many monks were sincere believers, monasteries were also centers of power, wealth, and politics. Some abbeys owned vast lands and controlled entire villages. Corruption was common. Abbots lived comfortably, while lower monks labored endlessly. Rules of silence, poverty, and obedience were often bent or broken. Some monks gambled, drank excessively, or used their position to dominate others. Church records themselves are full of complaints, punishments, and scandals involving monastic communities. Daily life was exhausting. Monks rose before dawn, often around 2 or 3 a.m., for prayers. The day was divided into rigid hours of worship, work, and silence. Sleep deprivation was normal. Combined with poor nutrition and hygiene, this weakened immune systems and shortened lives. Many monks entered monasteries as children and never knew any other existence. Others joined to escape famine or violence, only to find a different kind of suffering behind monastery walls. Despite this, monks were not ignorant or careless. Many genuinely believed that physical discomfort cleansed the soul. Enduring filth, hunger, and pain was seen as a form of devotion. Some even competed in self-denial, wearing the dirtiest clothes, eating the worst food, or refusing all comfort. Holiness, in their eyes, often meant living closer to decay than to cleanliness. And yet, from this grim environment came remarkable achievements. Monks preserved ancient texts, developed agriculture, brewed beer, treated the sick, and kept learning alive during centuries of instability. Their world was filthy, but it was also disciplined. Their bodies suffered, but their minds worked. This contrast is what makes medieval monks so fascinating. They lived surrounded by dirt, disease, and decay, yet believed they were reaching toward something pure and eternal. The filthy truth about medieval monks is not meant to mock them. It is meant to humanize them. They were not saints floating above reality, nor were they all corrupt hypocrites. They were men living in a brutal world, trying, often imperfectly, to make sense of suffering, faith, and duty. Their monasteries smelled of sweat and waste, echoed with coughing and prayers, and stood as reminders that even the most spiritual lives in history were built on very physical, very dirty foundations. Close your eyes now and let the present world dissolve into the grey mist of history. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a dense forest in the year 1150, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, step forward with me toward the heavy oak gates of the abbey, the iron hinges rusted by years of rain. We are about to enter the stone shell, the enclosure that separates the sacred from the profane. But as we pass through the archway, notice that the silence you expected is actually a hum of activity, a low vibration of life contained within high walls. The ground beneath your feet transitions from forest floor to packed mud and cobblestone, slick with the residue of a recent rain and the droppings of the monastery's livestock, which wander freely in the outer courtyard. It is twilight, the blue hour, and the stone walls of the abbey loom high above, blocking the wind but trapping everything else inside. In our modern imagination, we see these walls as pristine, perhaps bathed in the golden light of a Hollywood film. But run your hand along the rough masonry in your mind's eye. It is cold, slimy, with moss on the north side, and blackened by soot near the torches. This is the reality of the clausura, the enclosure. It was designed to keep the world out, yet historians often point out a fascinating irony. The plan of St. Gall, a famous 9th century architectural drawing of an ideal monastery, depicts a complex so vast and self-sufficient, with bakeries, breweries, stables, and workshops, that it resembles a bustling town more than a hermitage. This plan reveals that a monastery was never truly a quiet retreat. It was an industrial machine of salvation, and machines are noisy, messy things. Listen closely, and you won't just hear the Gregorian chant drifting from the chapel. You hear the bleating of sheep being herded into the lower pens, the clanging of a blacksmith repairing a plowshare, and the heavy hacking coughs of men whose lungs have breathed in smoke and stone dust for decades. The air here is distinct, a complex perfume of history. It smells of beeswax candles burning in the sanctuary, a sweet and heavy scent meant to carry prayers to heaven. But beneath that, there is the undeniable, earthy musk of unwashed wool. Hundreds of men live here, working and sleeping in close quarters. And in this era, personal space is a concept that simply does not exist. They are brothers, yes, but brothers who breathe the same stale air, share the same lice, and endure the same cramped conditions day after day. It is said that a blind man could identify a monk not by his holiness, but by the distinctive odor of damp habit and incense that clung to him like a second skin. As we walk deeper into the complex, moving from the outer workyards toward the inner sanctum, the stone shell feels less like a fortress and more like a hive. Every corner is utilized. Here, a pile of timber waits to be split. There, a basket of turnips sits covered in dirt from the garden. It is a clutter of survival. We often forget that these men were pioneers of a sort, battling not just the devil, but the elements. The stone that surrounds them is their protection, but it is also their cage. In the fading light, you might spot a young novice hurrying across the courtyard, his sandals slapping against the wet stones, perhaps late for vespers. He trips slightly, a reminder that even in this holy place, grace is not guaranteed, especially when the path is slippery with mud. He rights himself, flustered, glancing around to see if the abbot noticed his clumsiness. It is a small human moment in a place built for eternity. This is where our journey begins. Not in the heavens, but here in the mud, inside the cold, crowded, and wonderfully human shell of the monastery, where the strive for purity begins in the dirt. If you stand very still in the center of the cloister garth, the garden heart of the monastery, and listen beneath the chanting of the choir and the scratching of chickens in the dirt, you might hear a low, constant rumble. It is the sound of the earth breathing, or so it seems. In reality, it is the sound of water, captured, tamed, and forced to work. We move now from the open courtyard toward this sound, tracing the invisible veins of the abbey. While the stone walls reach for the heavens, a complex dark network of tunnels burrows deep into the mud, a testament to a truth often forgotten. These men of God are also master engineers. Historians often marvel at the hydraulic systems of orders like the Cistercians, who are famous for building their monasteries in remote swampy valleys, not just for solitude, but because they need the river. They do not merely settle by the water, they reroute it. Imagine the sheer labor involved. Men with wooden spades and iron picks, digging through clay and limestone to divert a wild stream into a straight, stone-lined channel. This is the Great Drain, the aorta of the monastery's sanitation, and it flows right beneath the heavy flagstones we are walking on. The water here is cold, rushing from the nearby hills, channeled first through lead pipes to the kitchen and the lavatorium, where monks wash their hands before meals, and finally, inevitably, to the building we are approaching now, the Reredoter. The name itself is a polite piece of medieval architecture, rear meaning back and daughter referring to the dormitory. It is the Back of the bedroom, the necessary house, the latrine block. It is usually a long two-story building extending away from the main sleeping quarters, often built on a bridge over the diverted river. As we step inside, the temperature drops. The air here is damp and carries a scent that no amount of incense can fully mask, a mix of ammonia, wet stone, and the brackish, muddy smell of the river below. It is not necessarily the overwhelming stench of a modern sewer, for there are no chemicals here, only organic decay, but it is heavy and unmistakable. It is the smell of hundreds of men living in close proximity, their biology unavoidable. The room is vast, a long gallery lined with wooden seats, sometimes polished smooth by generations of habits. There are no private stalls here, no locking doors to hide behind. The concept of privacy in the bathroom is a modern luxury, completely foreign to the medieval mind. Here a monk sits with his brethren, robe hiked up, staring at the stone wall opposite, or perhaps out a narrow window at the grey sky. Strict silence is usually maintained even here. It is a strange, solemn communal activity. You might imagine the tension of a young novice, desperate to cough or sneeze, terrified that a loud bodily noise might break the holy silence and earn a stern look from the older monk sitting 2 feet away. It is a vulnerable, humbling experience, reminding every man that no matter how high his prayers fly, he is tethered to the earth by his gut. Below the wooden seats, the architecture reveals its grim purpose. The waste falls directly into the stone channel of the great drain, 10 or 20 feet below. The theory, and it is a brilliant one for the 12th century, is that the diverted river, flowing rapidly through the narrow channel, will scour the stone clean, carrying the waste out of the monastery precincts and downstream to, well, to whoever lives downstream. In the rainy season, when the river is high and fierce, the system works with thunderous efficiency. The water roars beneath the floorboards, a dark torrent that scrubs the abbey clean. But history is rarely so cooperative. In the dry summer months, the river turns to a trickle. The flow slows, the waste piles up. Scholarly analysis of soil samples from excavated drain sites reveals a biological archive of what life was really like. The flush was not always powerful enough. Layers of sediment built up, hardening over years, requiring physical removal. This leads us to one of the most unfortunate jobs in the medieval world. While the choir monks sing the psalms, lay brothers or hired servants, often called gong farmers in the wider world, must descend into the drain with shovels and buckets to clear the blockages. It is dark, suffocating work, ankle-deep in the filth of holy men. Yet without this labor, the monastery would cease to function. The spiritual purity of the abbey relies entirely on this underground plumbing remaining clear. There is a stark beauty in the practicality of it. The reredoter is often situated to catch the wind, with high windows designed to ventilate the fumes. Some monasteries even divert a small portion of the kitchen waste, ash and charcoal, into the drain to help mask the smell. It shows a level of planning that contradicts the idea of the Dark Ages as a time of ignorance. These men understand that stagnant filth brings disease, even if they explain it as bad air or miasma rather than germs. By building their latrines over running water, they likely save themselves from the worst of the dysentery outbreaks that ravage the stagnant cesspits of the growing towns. They are cleaner than the kings in their castles, simply because they have harnessed the river. But let us pause and feel the draught that comes up through the wooden seats. It is mid-November in our story, and the wind is howling off the river, funneling up through the drain like a chimney. A visit to the reredoter in the depth of winter is a test of endurance. There is no heating here. The stone absorbs the frost. A monk might delay his visit as long as possible, huddled in his bed, only to be forced by nature to make the shivering dash across the walkway in the dark. It is a small, chilly misery, but a constant one. It is hard to meditate on the warmth of God's love when the bitter north wind is whistling against one's exposed backside. As we leave the reredoter, stepping back into the slightly warmer air of the cloister alley, we can still hear the water rushing below the flagstones. It carries away the physical evidence of the monk's humanity, washing it into the landscape. This water is the lifeblood of the abbey, cleaning, powering mills, and carrying waste, a continuous cycle that mirrors the monks' own repetitive lives. They drink the water, they use the water, they return the water. It is a connection to the natural world that they cannot sever, no matter how much they fast or pray. The rivers beneath the stone never stop flowing, a reminder that the monastery is a living organism, consuming and expelling, rooted deeply in the mud of the valley. And as the water flows away, it leaves behind the men themselves, bodies that, despite the river's help, are about to face a different kind of accumulation, one that water cannot easily wash away. We leave the rushing water of the drain behind us now, stepping away from the one place in the monastery where filth is efficiently removed, and turn our attention to the place where it is allowed to linger, the human skin. If you were to walk into the cloister walkways now, passing the row of monks sitting on stone benches reading their psalters, the first thing to hit you would not be a spiritual epiphany, but a wall of scent. It is a dense, biological gravity that hangs in the still air of the arcade. We live in a deodorized age where the natural smell of the human animal is scrubbed, masked, and feared. But here in the 12th century, the smell of the body is as natural as the smell of the rain or the livestock in the field. It is the sacred stench, a silent testimony to a life that has turned away from the vanity of the flesh. There is a room in the monastery called the bathhouse, but unlike the busy latrines or the bustling kitchen, this room is quiet, dusty, and often locked. To the modern mind, a bath is a daily necessity, a moment of relaxation and hygiene. To the medieval monk, it is a suspicious indulgence, a dangerous flirtation with luxury. We must remember that the early church fathers looked back at the great public baths of the Roman Empire not as feats of engineering, but as dens of vice, where naked bodies mingled in warm water, leading inevitably to sin. To reject the bath is to reject Rome, to reject softness, to reject the demands of the body. The rule of Saint Benedict, the constitution that governs these men's lives, is explicit and somewhat grudging on the matter. The use of baths shall be offered to the sick as often as it is necessary. To the healthy, and especially to the young, these shall be granted more rarely. Rarely is a word that carries a heavy weight. For a healthy adult monk in the prime of his life, rarely might mean twice a year, perhaps once before Christmas and once before Easter. For the strictest ascetics, it might mean never. Imagine the physical reality of this: a body working in the fields, sweating under the summer sun, dusted with flour from the bakery, splattered with mud from the garden, and then simply drying off. Layer upon layer of sweat, oil, and dead skin accumulates over the weeks and months. It forms a kind of second skin, a protective, gritty crust that becomes a part of the monk's physical identity. You might wonder, do they not smell it? Do they not gag at the stench of their neighbor during the long hours of choir practice? Historians and anthropologists suggest a phenomenon known as olfactory fatigue. When everyone smells the same, a mix of wood smoke, unwashed wool, stale sweat, and damp stone, the nose stops registering it as offensive. It simply becomes the background static of existence, much like the hum of a refrigerator in a modern home. In fact, to smell too clean, to smell of soap or crushed flowers, would be the offensive note. It would signal pride. It would signal that you care more about your body than your soul. There is a dark humor in this. The holiest man in the abbey is often the one you want to sit furthest away from. However, we must be careful not to paint them as entirely feral. They are not covered in visible muck. Monastic rules are strict about cleanliness of the hands and face. Before every meal, the monks file into the lavatorium, a communal washing trough near the refectory entrance, to rinse their hands. It is a ritual of purification, washing off the dust of labor before touching the bread that represents God's provision. They scrub their fingernails. They splash cold water on their cheeks to wake themselves for prayers. But the washing stops at the neck and the wrists. Everything underneath the robe is a secret, a dark landscape of unwashed geography that remains untouched by water for seasons at a time. There is also a medical fear at play here. In the medieval understanding of health, the skin is a porous barrier. Warm water opens the pores. If the pores are open, the bad air, the miasma that carries sickness, can enter the body and upset the balance of the humors. A bath is not just morally suspect, it is physically risky. It is safer to keep the pores sealed with a healthy layer of dirt. When a monk does fall ill and is ordered to bathe by the infirmarian, it is a serious medical procedure, not a spa day. He is led to the bathhouse, stripped of his habit, and lowered into a wooden tub of warm water, sometimes infused with bitter herbs. It is a moment of extreme vulnerability. For a man who has spent decades hiding his body under heavy wool, the sensation of water against naked skin can be overwhelming, shocking, and deeply uncomfortable. He feels exposed, defenseless, his spiritual armor stripped away. Yet, despite the lack of bathing, the monastery fights the smell in other ways. We see lay brothers scattering fresh rushes, green stems of plants, on the earthen floors. Among them, they mix meadowsweet, wild mint, and lavender. As the monks walk over these herbs, crushing them with their sandals, they release bursts of sweet, sharp fragrance that rise up to combat the heaviness of the body odors. It is a battle of scents, the living perfume of the garden against the stagnant musk of the dormitory. On feast days, the church is clouded with heavy incense, frankincense, and myrrh, burning in swinging thuribles. This is not just for theatrical effect, it is a practical necessity. When hundreds of unwashed men crowd into the nave for a high mass, the air needs to be scrubbed with smoke if it cannot be scrubbed with soap. There is a profound humility in this filth. To be a monk is to accept that you are made of dust and will return to dust. Why polish the vessel if it is destined to break? We see an old brother, Brother Thomas, let's call him, sitting by a pillar. He has not bathed in 3 years. His skin is grey and dry, like parchment. He scratches absent-mindedly at his side, a motion so common here It goes unnoticed. He does not feel dirty in a shameful way. He feels mortified. He has deadened his flesh to the pleasures of the world. The itchiness, the stickiness, the smell, these are constant low-level irritations that serve as a hair shirt for the senses. They remind him, with every uncomfortable shift in his seat, that his true home is not in this physical world. This sacred stench also serves as a social barrier. It marks the monks apart from the aristocracy they often come from. A knight might bathe before a banquet. A lady might use rose water. By smelling like the poor, or worse than the poor, the monks align themselves with the lowest of society, at least in theory. It is a chosen poverty of hygiene. But as we stand near them, invisible observers in the timeline, the romance of the idea clashes with the biological reality. The air around Brother Thomas is sour and sharp. It speaks of bacteria and fungus thriving in the damp, dark microclimate between skin and wool. It is the smell of a human animal in a cage of its own making. And so, the body remains a closed book, its cover dusty and worn. The water of the river flows past the walls, but it is not invited in to cleanse the flesh. The monks carry their soil with them, a portable wilderness of odors that defines their space. As the bell rings for the next office, they stand in unison, a rustling of heavy fabric, and the air shifts, carrying that complex, heavy scent up towards the vaulted ceiling, where it mingles with the prayers and drifts, slowly, into the stone itself. The monastery absorbs it all, but the smell of the body is only the beginning of the discomfort. For covering this unwashed skin is a garment designed not for comfort, but for endurance. A fabric that holds the smell, traps the heat, and harbors guests of a very different kind. The scent of the body, heavy and unwashed, does not simply vanish into the air. It is captured, held, and amplified by the monk's constant companion, the habit. As we move from the damp air of the cloister into the dim light of the vestry, we must confront the reality of this garment. In paintings, the monastic robe falls in graceful, smooth folds, suggesting a soft, heavy comfort. But reach out in your mind and touch the fabric worn by the brother standing before us. It is not the refined, chemically treated wool of a modern suit. It is burl, or russet, coarse, raw, and alive with the memory of the sheep it came from. It is thick, woven with a loose, uneven grain that feels less like clothing and more like a carpet wrapped around the human frame. This fabric is the defining boundary of a monk's existence. From the moment he takes his vows until the moment he is lowered into the grave, the wool is always against his skin. It is a tactile reminder of his station, a constant scratching penance. The wool still holds the natural oils of the animal, lanolin, which makes it somewhat water-resistant, a blessing in the rain but a curse in the heat. In the height of summer, under the July sun, the habit transforms into a personal kiln. The lanolin traps the body heat, sealing the monk inside his own sweat. Imagine working in the hayfields, swinging a scythe for hours, encased in 10 pounds of dense, suffocating fabric that does not breathe. The sweat soaks into the wool, making it heavy and stiff, rubbing raw patches of skin at the neck and under the arms. There is no relief, no rolling up the sleeves, no unbuttoning the collar to catch a breeze. To expose the flesh is to expose the soul to temptation. And so, they sweat, they bake, they endure the prickly heat that spreads across their backs like a map of their suffering, offering it up as a silent prayer. But if summer is a furnace, winter reveals the wool's treacherous nature in a different way. When the autumn rains begin, the hem of the habit drags constantly through the mud and wet grass of the monastery grounds. The fabric acts like a wick, drinking up the moisture until the bottom foot of the robe is a sodden, freezing weight that slaps against the ankles with every step. It never truly dries. From November to March, a monk's lower legs are perpetually encased in damp, cold wool. This constant exposure leads to trench foot conditions long before the trenches of modern warfare, skin turning white, numb, and prone to cracking. The cold seeps upward, a creeping chill that settles in the bones. While the wool is meant to be warm, in the draughty stone corridors of the abbey, it acts as a damp shroud, holding the cold against the body rather than insulating it. Beneath this heavy outer shell, the question of what, if anything, is worn against the skin is a subject of historical curiosity and subtle theological debate. The rule of Saint Benedict is practical but vague, ordering that monks be given clothes suitable for the climate. In the early days, and in the stricter orders like the Cistercians, the use of linen, a plant-based fabric that is softer and easier to wash, was forbidden as a luxury. Linen was for ladies and bishops. Monks wore wool next to the skin. This meant the coarse fibers rubbed directly against the most sensitive parts of the body, day and night. The stamen, or woolen undershirt, was a source of constant low-grade irritation, a physical agitation that kept the monk from ever feeling truly at ease in the world. Scholars still debate the universal use of praise, medieval underwear. These were baggy linen or wool drawers held up by a drawstring. While practical for riding horses or working the fields, some stricter interpretations of monastic rules viewed them as unnecessary indulgence for those living within the walls. However, records show that as the Middle Ages progressed, most monasteries conceded to the need for undergarments, largely for hygiene. Yet even these were not the clean, elasticated items we know. They were voluminous, bunching up under the heavy robes, prone to slipping, and difficult to manage quickly during those freezing, urgent trips to the latrine. They were just one more layer of complexity in a life striving for simplicity. The maintenance of these garments is a monumental task that creates its own sensory landscape. Monastic laundry is not a weekly chore. It is a seasonal industrial event. Because washing the heavy wool habits is so labor-intensive and damages the fabric, it is done rarely, perhaps only 2 or 3 times a year. When the Great Wash occurs, it is an all-hands operation. Huge wooden tubs are filled with river water, heated over fires. The soap is a harsh, stinging mixture of wood ash and animal fat, or sometimes stale urine, which contains ammonia and is an excellent degreaser. The smell of boiling wet wool, lye, and urine clouds the monastery courtyard. The monks or servants must stomp on the sodden habits with their bare feet to agitate the dirt out. A physically exhausting dance in scalding grey water. When the robes are finally hauled out, they are incredibly heavy, requiring 2 men to wring them. They are hung on hedges or wooden racks to dry in the wind, looking like the shed skins of giants. But here lies the problem. Wool shrinks. A monk might receive his freshly washed habit only to find it has ridden up 3 inches at the ankle and become tighter across the shoulders. The fabric hardens as it dries, turning into a stiff carapace that must be broken in all over again. For the first week after washing, the monastery is filled with the sound of stiff fabric crinkling and men shifting uncomfortably as they try to soften their armor. Most of the time, however, the habit is not washed. It is simply worn. It absorbs the spills of the refectory, the drip of porosity, the splash of ale. It collects the dust of the scriptorium and the soot of the candle. It bears the stains of ink, mud, and grease. These marks are not seen as signs of slovenliness, but as a record of service. A pristine habit is the sign of a monk who does no work. But this accumulation has a consequence. The fabric becomes a geological record of the monk's year. The weave gets clogged with dead skin cells and oils, becoming shiny and smooth in high friction areas like the elbows and buttocks. The habit also disrupts the one time of day meant for rest. Monastic rules dictate that monks must sleep in their clothes, girded and ready, so that they can rise instantly for the night office of matins without the delay of dressing. Imagine lying down on a straw mattress, the rough wool bunching up around your waist, the leather belt digging into your ribs. You cannot turn over easily. The hood gets tangled around your neck. There is no sensation of cool sheets against bare skin, no release from the day's uniform. You are swaddled in your vocation, even in your dreams. The heat of the body in the bed warms the layers of stale wool, releasing the trapped odors of the day. The smoke, the sweat, the onions from dinner, creating a personal microclimate of stale air that the monk breathes in all night long. Yet, there is a strange psychological comfort in this heavy enclosure. The habit is a cocoon. When a monk pulls his hood up, he cuts off his peripheral vision. He sees only what is in front of him. The muffling effect of the wool over his ears dampens the noise of the world. It creates a portable cell, a way to be alone even in a crowd. It signals to the world and to the man himself that he has resigned from the game of appearance. He no longer has a shape, a status, or an individual style. He is a block of brown or black, a piece of the monastery's architecture that happens to breathe. But as the months pass and the winter deepens, the habit becomes more than just clothing. It becomes a habitat. The warm, humid, protected environment between the wool and the skin, undisturbed by frequent washing and fueled by the body's heat, sends out a silent invitation. Nature abhors a vacuum, and it loves a warm shelter. And so, the monk's robe, his symbol of holiness, begins to crawl. The wool, which was once the coat of a sheep, is about to be colonized again, becoming a bustling city for the smallest and most persistent of the monastery's uninvited guests. The silence of the monastery library is profound. A monk sits at a slanted desk, his quill hovering over a sheet of vellum, ready to copy the Gospel of John. He is perfectly still, a statue of devotion. But if you could zoom in, past the stillness of his posture, past the heavy folds of his wool habit, and onto the landscape of his skin, you would see that he is not alone. He is never alone. The silence of the room belies the riot of activity happening millimeters from his ribs. He is a host, a walking ecosystem for the uninvited brethren, the lice, fleas, and mites that thrive in the warm, unwashed dark of medieval monastic life. The itch is a constant, low-level torture. It begins as a tickle, a phantom sensation at the base of the spine or under the armpit. Then the sharp, sudden pinch of a bite. The monk flinches, his hand twitching instinctively toward the spot, but he stops. To scratch during work is a distraction. To scratch during Mass is a disruption. And so, he learns the art of the subtle shift, rubbing his back against the hard wooden chair, or pressing his arm against his side to crush the offender. It is a secret dance of discomfort. The irony is sharp. He has sworn a vow of celibacy to avoid the complications of family, yet he supports a family of thousands, generation after generation, living and dying in the folds of his clothes. The body louse, Pediculus humanus, is the king of this hidden domain. Unlike the head louse, which lives in the hair, the body louse lives in the clothing, venturing onto the skin only to feed. The thick, rough seams of the wool habit are their castles. Here, protected from the cold air and fueled by the monk's body heat, they lay their eggs, knits, cementing them to the fibers. If a monk were to turn his habit inside out in the bright sunlight, the seams would appear to be dusted with white powder. But the powder moves. In the dim light of the dormitory or the church, these creatures are invisible, but their presence is felt as a constant creeping vibration, a reminder that the flesh is effectively meat. At night, the assault changes fronts. When the monk lies down on his mattress, he meets the flea. Monastic beds are simple, a wooden frame filled with straw or hay. This stuffing is meant to be changed regularly, but regularly is a relative term. Fresh straw is a luxury. Old straw is a habitat. It breaks down into a dusty chaff that provides the perfect breeding ground for fleas. As the monk sleeps, the fleas jump from the bedding to the sleeper, feasting on the blood of the holy man just as readily as they would a rat. The morning ritual often involves shaking out the blanket, not just to straighten it, but to dislodge the night's guests. Yet, they always return. They are part of the furniture. Historians and archaeologists have found undeniable proof of this infestation. Combs from the period are often double-sided, with one side having extremely fine teeth designed specifically for scraping lice and nits from the hair and beard. But for the body louse, combs are useless. The only cure is boiling the clothes, which, as we have seen, happens rarely, and so the infestation is managed, not cured. It is a cycle of life. A monk might spend his designated free time in the cloister not reading, but lousing, methodically picking through the seams of his undershirt, cracking the parasites between his thumbnails. It is a grooming ritual as old as primates, performed now by men who can read Latin and calculate the movement of the stars. The Church's attitude towards these parasites is complex. On one hand, they are a nuisance, a result of the fall of man. On the other, they are seen by some as a badge of holiness. The logic is twisted but sincere. If the body is the enemy of the soul, then anything that punishes the body is a friend to the spirit. To endure the biting of lice without complaint is a form of martyrdom. We have the famous, if gruesome, account of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. When he was murdered in his cathedral in 1170, the monks preparing his body for burial removed his outer vestments to find a hair shirt underneath. Chronicles reported, with a mix of horror and awe, that the hair shirt seethed with lice, the creatures boiling over the fabric like water in a simmering pot as the body cooled. To the medieval mind, this was not a sign of poor hygiene. It was proof of his extreme saintliness. He had suffered silently for God, feeding the hungry, even if the hungry were vermin. But for the average monk, not aiming for immediate canonization, the lice are simply a misery. They carry disease, specifically typhus and trench fever. though the monks do not know the mechanism. They only know that sometimes a jail fever sweeps through the dormitory, leaving men shivering and delirious. The lice are the invisible couriers of death, moving from monk to monk during the kiss of peace at Mass, or while sitting shoulder to shoulder in the chapter house. The community shares everything: their food, their prayers, and their parasites. There are attempts at defense, of course. Medieval herbals are full of recipes for repelling vermin. Monks might strew wormwood, rue, or fleabane in their beds, hoping the strong, bitter oils will drive the creatures away. They might wear small sachets of lavender around their necks. But these are gentle deterrents against a relentless biological force. The lice eventually grow used to the smell, or simply move to a different patch of skin. The war is unwinnable. The monk must simply accept that his body is a feeding ground. This constant physical irritation has a psychological effect. It keeps the monk in a state of perpetual alertness. He can never truly relax. Even in deep prayer, a sudden bite can snap him back to physical reality. It prevents the sleep of the sluggard. Perhaps, in a dark way, it helps him keep the vigil. It is a prickly, crawling hair shirt that nature provides for free. It humbles the proud. A nobleman's son who joins the order, used to silk and servants, finds himself scratching just as frantically as the peasant's son next to him. The louse is the great equalizer. It respects no lineage. And so the monk learns to dissociate from his skin. He treats his body like a troublesome donkey, something to be fed, watered, and beaten when it misbehaves, but ultimately separate from his true self. The itching becomes a rhythm, a background static to the Gregorian chant. But there are moments when the biology of the monastery must be addressed more aggressively. The lice are too small to fight with weapons, but there are other parts of the body that can be cut, controlled, and purged. As we leave the itchy, crawling darkness of the dormitory, we move toward a place of sharper instruments, where the monks submit to the blade and the bowl in a bloody ritual meant to cleanse them of more than just hair. The itching of the unwashed skin and the crawling of the lice are constant background irritations, but the monastery has sharper, more violent ways of disciplining the flesh. We move now from the dormitory to the cloister alley, where a wooden stool sits on the flagstones next to a basin of cold water. It is time for the rasura, the ritual shaving. In the modern world, shaving is a personal, daily habit, often done with hot water, lubricating foam, and a sharp, disposable steel blade. Here, it is a communal ordeal, a test of patience and pain. The defining visual mark of a monk is the tonsure, the ring of hair left around a shaved scalp, intended to mimic the crown of thorns worn by Christ. It is a permanent brand of holiness, marking the wearer as a slave of God. But maintaining this symbol is a brutal process. There are no professional barbers here, only other brothers. The barber for the day might be the cellarer or the porter, a man whose hands are calloused from chopping wood, now wielding a razor made of bronze or iron. These metals do not hold an edge like modern steel. They dull quickly, and without the luxury of hot water or rich lather, soap is rare and harsh, often just a mix of tallow and ash. The razor does not glide. It drags. Listen to the sound, a dry, rhythmic scraping, like a knife buttering toast, punctuated by the sharp intake of breath from the monk on the stool. The razor catches on a patch of dry skin or a hidden mole, and a line of bright red beads appears on the pale scalp. The barber pauses, perhaps wiping the blood away with a rough linen rag that has already wiped 3 other heads this morning. Hygiene is communal, and so is the risk. The water in the basin turns cloudy and grey with stubble and soap scum as the line of monks moves forward. They do not change the water for every man. The razor is dipped, swirled, and brought back to the next head. It is a perfect vector for Sarcosis barbae, a chronic fungal or bacterial infection of the hair follicles known as barber's itch. It leaves the scalp red, inflamed, and crusted with pustules, a painful, weeping crown that makes the wearing of a wool hood agony. Yet the tonsure must be maintained. Every 3 weeks or so, the monks submit to the blade again, break-opening the scabs, scraping the sensitive skin, renewing their vows in blood and irritation. But the razor is not the only blade the monk fears, or strangely desires. We must now walk to a special room, often located near the infirmary, where the fire is kept burning high. This is the site of the minutio, the bloodletting. To the modern mind, draining blood from a healthy person seems like madness, a sure way to weaken the body. But in the medieval medical model, based on the ancient theory of the 4 humors, it is essential maintenance. The body is seen as a container of fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, that must be kept in balance. An excess of blood, or plethora, is dangerous. It leads to fever, aggression, and physical lust. For a monk whose life is dedicated to crushing desire, an excess of blood is a spiritual hazard. It makes the body too hot, too alive. And so, several times a year, usually after the great festivals, the monks are bled. It is a scheduled event, almost like a car service. The monk sits by the fire, rolling up his sleeve. The infirmarian, or a visiting barber surgeon, ties a tourniquet around the upper arm until the vein bulges blue against the pale skin. With a small double-edged lancet, he strikes. The goal is not a small sample, but a significant drain, often a pint or more. The blood flows into a brass bowl, thick and dark. The smell of copper fills the warm room, a metallic tang that mixes with the scent of wood smoke. The monk watches his own vitality leave him, feeling the lightheadedness wash over him. A physical swoon that is often interpreted as a spiritual quieting. Here is the filthy reality of it. The lancet is wiped on a cloth, but rarely sterilized. The bowl is rinsed, but the invisible microscopic world remains. If the infirmarian has just bled a brother with a fever or a blood-borne illness, the lancet carries that sickness into the vein of the next man. The tourniquets are reused. The bandages are washed in the river and dried, but they are not sterile. The minutio is a highway for infection, moving pathogens directly into the bloodstream of the community. A monk might enter the room healthy, seeking to balance his humors, and leave with the seeds of his own death planted deep in his veins. Yet, despite the pain and the risk, there is a dark secret about bloodletting. The monks love it. In fact, it is often the highlight of their season. We must understand the crushing monotony and physical rigor of their daily lives, the sleep deprivation, the cold food, the hard labor, the endless standing in choir. When a monk is bled, he is officially declared a patient. For 3 days, the strict rules of the monastery are suspended for him. He is excused from the midnight office of matins. He can sleep through the night. He is excused from manual labor in the fields. Best of all, he is allowed to eat pittance food, meat, eggs, and stronger wine to rebuild his strength. He can sit by the fire and talk. Historians often chuckle at the records showing how eagerly monks volunteered for unscheduled bleedings. There are accounts of abbots having to restrict the practice because too many brothers were suddenly claiming to feel unbalanced and in need of the lancet right before the harvest work began. It creates a perverse incentive. To be wounded is to be rested. To be weak is to be fed. The minutio becomes a grim holiday, a vacation purchased with a pint of one's own blood. It humanizes them deeply. They are not masochists. They are exhausted men, desperate for a break, willing to endure the knife for a few days of warmth and roast chicken. Scholars still debate the primary motivation for this practice in religious houses. Was it purely medical, a sincere attempt to ward off illness? Or was it, as some Victorian historians prudishly suggested, a deliberate tool to suppress sexual desire? The logic was that a man weakened by blood loss has little energy for sinful thoughts. By draining the hot blood, the monks were physically lowering the temperature of their passions. In this light, the brass bowl becomes a vessel of purification, catching the liquid sin as it drips from the arm. The pale, trembling monk who stumbles out of the bleeding room is seen as spiritually safer than the ruddy, energetic one. But there is a cost to this cycle of drain and refill. A monk who has been bled is dizzy, his immune system compromised. The wound on his arm is bound with linen that might be damp. He returns to the cold dormitory, his body confused by the sudden loss of fluid. If he is lucky, the incision heals into a small white scar, joining the map of other scars on his arm from years of maintenance. If he is unlucky, the wound turns hot and angry, the red streak of sepsis climbing up the limb. And then, the temporary rest of the bloodletting room turns into a permanent residency in the place where the monastery hides its broken pieces. We watch the monk, clutching his bandaged arm, steadying himself against the cold stone wall as he walks down the corridor. He is heading toward the one building where the silence is broken, not by chant, but by groans. The infirmary, where the shadows are long, and the medicine is as dangerous as the disease. The corridor that leads to the infirmary is often called the Dead Man's Walk in local folklore, though the monks themselves simply call it the Passage of Mercy. We leave the shivering brother with his bandaged arm and push open the heavy door into the Domus Infamorum, the house of the sick. The atmosphere here shifts instantly. If the church is the soul of the monastery and the cloister is its heart, the infirmary is its aching, failing body. The air is warmer here, heated by a dedicated fire that burns day and night, a rare luxury in a world of stone cold. But the warmth carries a smell that hits the back of the throat, a thick, sweet-sour cocktail of boiled cabbage, vinegar, camphor, dried sage, and the unmistakable cloying scent of festering wounds and unwashed linens. The infirmary is not a hospital in the modern sense. There are no white sheets, no sterile instruments, no beeping machines. It is a large, open hall, much like the dormitory, but here the beds are occupied by men who cannot rise for matins. In the shadows of the flickering rushlights, we see the patients. There is an elderly brother, his mind lost to dementia, picking at the wool of his blanket. Next to him lies a young novice with a broken leg, the bone set by the cellarer and bound with wooden splints. And next to him, coughing a wet, rattling cough that sprays droplets into the stagnant air, is a monk with the lung sickness. consumption, or tuberculosis. Here lies the first filthy truth of medieval medicine. Isolation is virtually unknown. The concept of contagion, that invisible seeds of disease jump from one person to another, is not fully understood. Disease is often thought to be a result of an internal imbalance of humors, or a punishment for sin, not a microbial invasion. So the man with the broken leg breathes the same air as the man coughing up blood. The infirmary, intended to be a place of healing, is often a perfect incubator for death. A minor injury can become fatal simply because the patient is placed in the bed of a man who died of typhus the day before, on sheets that have been merely smoothed down, not boiled. The man in charge of this chaotic ward is the infirmarian. He is one of the most overworked men in the abbey. He is doctor, nurse, pharmacist, and undertaker, all rolled into one. Watch him as he moves between the beds. He carries a glass flask, the matula, holding it up to the torchlight. Inside is the amber liquid of a patient's urine. This is uroscopy, the primary diagnostic tool of the age. He consults a chart on the wall, a urine wheel that categorizes the fluid by color, smell, and even taste. He is looking for clouds, for blood, for the black bile that signals impending death. It is a primitive science, intimate and gross. He does not wear gloves. He handles the flask, wipes his hands on his apron, and moves to the next patient to feed him a spoonful of broth. The cross-contamination is invisible, but constant. The medicines he dispenses are a mixture of genuine botanical wisdom and horrifying superstition. The monastery garden, the herbularius, provides sage, mint, fennel, and poppy, plants that truly do soothe stomachs or dull pain. But when these fail, the treatments get darker. Medieval medical texts preserved in these very libraries recommend cures that make us shudder. For a festering wound, a poultice might be made not just of herbs, but of earthworms, crushed snails, or even animal dung, believed to draw out the poison. Imagine the reality: a holy man praying for healing, while his open sore is packed with the excrement of a sheep. It is a desperate grasp for a cure in a world where infection is a death sentence. Historians often debate how much medicine actually happened here. Some argue that the infirmary was primarily a place of spiritual preparation for death, not physical intervention. The logic was cold but consistent. If God sent the illness as a trial, who was the monk to fight it too hard? To cure the body at the cost of the soul was a bad trade. Therefore, the filth of the sickness was sometimes viewed with a disturbing passivity. A bedsore, a rotting ulcer on the flesh caused by lying still for too long, might be seen as a jewel of suffering, a chance to earn merit in heaven. And bedsores are common. The mattresses are straw, the sheets are coarse linen. Patients who are too weak to move lie in their own waste for hours. There are no catheters, no plastic pans. A wooden bucket is shoved under the bed, but accidents are inevitable. The infirmarian and his assistants do their best, but they are men, not angels. They get tired. They get nose-blind to the smell of ammonia and gangrene. We might see a lay brother sprinkling dried lavender on a wet spot on the floor, masking the mess, rather than scrubbing it, simply because he has 20 other patients crying out for water. Yet, there is a tenderness here amidst the squalor. We see the infirmarian sitting by the bed of a dying monk, holding a cup of water to cracked lips. He whispers the psalms, his voice a low drone that competes with the wheezing of the sick. He wipes a fevered brow with a cloth dipped in rose water. In a world without painkillers, save for perhaps a dangerous tincture of hemlock or opium poppy, presence is the only analgesic available. The brotherhood is strongest here. When a monk enters the death throes, the ritual requires that he not die on a soft bed. In his final moments, he is lifted from the mattress and placed on the ground, on a sheet of haircloth sprinkled with ashes in the shape of a cross. This custom serves a grim purpose. It is an act of ultimate humility, returning the man to the dust from which he came before he has even taken his last breath. But practically, it means the monk spends his final agony lying on the cold, dirty floor of the infirmary, surrounded by the dust and footsteps of the living. It is a raw, unpolished exit. There is no sanitizing of death here. The other patients watch. They see the struggle. They hear the death rattle, the fluid accumulating in the throat. They know their turn is coming. As the monk breathes his last, the room falls silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The infirmarian closes the brother's eyes and immediately begins the practical work of cleaning the body. There are no morticians. The same hands that fed him soup now wash his cold limbs with warm water and vinegar. The filth of life, the sweat, the sores, the parasites, is finally washed away in preparation for burial. The body is sewn into his habit, often the same one he wore for years, or perhaps a cleaner one saved for this moment. But as we turn to leave the infirmary, stepping away from the heavy, suffocating air of the sick room, we realize that the cycle continues. The bed that has just been vacated will not stay cold for long. The sheets will be turned, perhaps sprinkled with vinegar, and a new sufferer will be brought in from the dormitory. The infirmary is a revolving door of biology. It is the place where the monastery's battle against nature is lost over and over again. The stone walls absorb the groans, the floorboards drink the spills, and the smoke from the fire carries the spirit and the smell up into the night sky. We need fresh air. We need to move away from the stillness of the dying and toward the heat and noise of the living. We follow the smell of wood smoke not to a sickbed, but to a place of furious activity, where the filth is greasy, the noise is deafening, and the appetites of the holy men are fueled. We step out of the shadowed, silent oppression of the infirmary and into a courtyard where the air suddenly shifts, becoming thick, greasy, and alive with the roar of a contained inferno. We are approaching the monastery kitchen, a building usually detached from the main cloister for a very practical reason. If it catches fire, and it often does, the monks do not want the library and the dormitory to burn down with it. As we push through the heavy wooden door, the sensory assault is immediate and overwhelming. If the church is the realm of the spirit, this is the realm of the gut. The heat hits you like a physical blow, a wall of temperature rising from the massive central hearths where whole tree trunks are burning down to white-hot ash. The noise is a chaotic symphony of clattering iron pots, the hacking of cleavers against wood, and the shouting of the kitchener, the senior monk whose job it is to feed 100 hungry men without running out of beans. The space itself is cavernous, the ceiling lost in a permanent twilight of smoke that drifts lazily toward the vents in the roof. But look at the walls. They are not the whitewashed stone of the chapel. They are coated in a glistening black lacquer of centuries-old soot and polymerized grease. This is the flavor of the monastery, trapped in the architecture. In a modern kitchen, surfaces are stainless steel, sanitized and wiped down with bleach. Here, hygiene is a battle against entropy that is mostly lost. The floor is packed earth or flagstone, slick with spilled animal fat, oil, and the crushed remnants of vegetable peelings. To walk across it is to skate on a layer of organic residue. The men working here are not the contemplative scholars of the library. They are often lay brothers or hired servants, their habits tucked up into their belts, their sleeves rolled high to reveal arms scarred by burns and scalds. They are covered in a film of sweat and flour paste. Watch the cook nearest to us. He is stirring a cauldron the size of a bathtub with a wooden paddle that looks like an oar. He is sweating profusely in the heat. There is no air conditioning, no fan. As he works, a bead of sweat rolls down his forehead, hangs for a moment on the tip of his nose, and then, plop, drops silently into the pottage. It is a tiny, salty addition to the evening meal that no rule of St. Benedict can prevent. It is the secret ingredient of monastic cuisine, the cook himself. The hygiene practices would send a modern health inspector into a catatonic state. There is no running hot water tap to rinse the knife that just cut a raw chicken before it cuts the cheese. The dishcloth hanging from the cook's belt is a dark, stiff rag that is used to wipe the table, the knife, the bowl, and the cook's own face. It is a universal tool of cross-contamination. And then there are the animals. We often think of pets as a modern domestic luxury, but here, animals are working members of the kitchen staff. A large, scarred tomcat sits casually on the food preparation table, watching a mouse scurry behind a sack of flour. The cat is tolerated, even welcomed, because the mouse is the greater evil. But the cat also walks through the ashes, licks its own fur, and then walks across the cutting board where the bread is being sliced. The food being prepared is simple, heavy, and monotonous. The staple is pottage, a thick stew of oats, beans, peas, and whatever vegetables are in season, leeks, onions, cabbage. It simmers in the great cauldron, sometimes for days. This brings us to the perpetual stew theory. In some busy kitchens, the pot is never fully emptied or scrubbed. New ingredients are simply thrown in to top it up. The broth at the bottom might be older than the novice monk who eats it. While the boiling temperature kills most bacteria, the edges of the pot, where the soup cools and crusts, are a bacterial playground. The flavor is likely deep, complex, and slightly fermented. But let us look at the beans. They are everywhere. Fava beans, field beans, peas. They are the fuel of the medieval world, the primary source of protein for men who are restricted from eating flesh meat, four-legged animals, for much of the year. This diet has a very audible consequence. The dormitory at night is rarely silent. It is filled with the digestive protests of 100 men processing gallons of bean stew. There is a gentle humor in this. The brothers are united in prayer, but also in gas. It is the great leveler. Even the abbot cannot escape the biological reality of a legume-heavy diet. Historians still argue about the strictness of the meat diet. The rule forbids the meat of quadrupeds for healthy monks. But birds were often considered aquatic, or distinct enough to be a loophole. And then there is the misericord, a special dining room where monks who were weak or recovering could eat meat. Records show that in some monasteries, half the community would suddenly feel weak on the day roast pork was served. It was a pious fiction, a way to obey the letter of the law while completely ignoring its spirit. We see a tray of roasted capons being prepared now, the skin golden and crackling, dripping fat into the fire. The smell is intoxicating, a torture for the young novice peeling turnips in the corner, who must stick to his gruel. Water is another filthy truth of the kitchen. The well water is often suspect, especially if the latrines we visited earlier are too close to the water table, a common architectural oversight. To drink water is to gamble with dysentery, so the kitchen is also a brewery. Small beer or ale is the standard drink. It is weak, thick, and nutritious, essentially liquid bread. But because it is brewed, boiled, it is safer than water. Imagine a workplace where everyone, from the head cook to the scullery boy, is mildly buzzed from dawn until dusk. It explains some of the shouting, and perhaps some of the accidents. We watch a server drop a loaf of bread on the greasy floor. He does not throw it away. That would be the sin of waste. He picks it up, blows on it, as if his breath is sterile, and wipes it on his habit. It goes back on the platter. The 5-second rule here is more like the 5-minute rule. If the rats haven't tracked it away, it is still edible. Speaking of rats, they are the silent observers in the rafters. They wait for the lights to go out. The struggle to protect the grain and the cheese from these rodents is a war that never ends. The kitchen is a fortress under siege, not by armies, but by hunger, the hunger of the monks and the hunger of every other creature in the valley. The cleaning process, when it happens, is abrasive. We see a boy scrubbing a pot, not with a sponge, but with a handful of river sand and straw. It scours the metal effectively, but it leaves grit. The wooden bowls, or trenchers, absorb the oils of 1,000 meals. They are dark with age. When a monk eats his meal, he is tasting the ghost of every meal that came before it. There is a continuity in the filth. As the bell rings for the main meal, the chaos in the kitchen reaches a crescendo. The servers form a line, grabbing the hot platters. The steam rising from the food mingles with the smoke of the room. The kitchener wipes his sooty hands on his apron and takes a deep breath. He has survived another service. The food is hot, it is plentiful, and if it contains a little bit of ash, a cat hair, or the sweat of a brother's brow, well, that is just the texture of community life. We follow the procession of food out of the heat and smoke, through the covered walkway, toward the refectory where the hungry men wait. But before we join them, we must look at where this food comes from. The kitchen is just the transformation point. The real battle against rot and ruin happens in the dark, cool silence of the storerooms, where the abbey's wealth is measured in sacks of grain and barrels of salted fish, and where the guardians fight a desperate war against the smallest of thieves. We leave the chaotic heat of the kitchen and step through a low, reinforced door into the sudden, stunning cool of the undercroft. The air here is different, still, dry and heavy, with a scent that is both comforting and slightly cloying. The smell of thousands of pounds of grain sleeping in the dark. We are in the domain of the cellarer, the guardian of the grain, and in many ways, the most powerful man in the monastery after the abbot. While the choir monks pray for the soul, the cellarer fights for the body, waging a silent, desperate war against an army of millions that seeks to devour the abbey from the inside out. The room is vast, a forest of stone pillars supporting the vaulted ceiling above. In the dim light of a single lantern, fire is the terrifying enemy here, so light is kept to a minimum. We see the wealth of the brotherhood. It is not gold or silver, but sacks. Mountains of burlap sacks piled high against the walls, barrels of salted herring, and hanging sides of cured bacon for the guests and the sick, of course. To the casual eye, it looks like abundance. To the cellarer, it looks like a ticking clock. In a world without refrigerators, without preservatives, and without vacuum sealing, every single item in this room is in the slow process of dying. The filth here is the filth of decay, the biological imperative of nature to reclaim organic matter. Let us look closer at the grain bins: wheat, rye, barley, and oats, the corn of the medieval world. They are the staff of life, the base of the bread and the beer that keep the community running. But scoop up a handful of the grain. Look closely at the golden kernels. There is movement. The corn weevil, Cytophilus cranarius, is a tiny beetle with a long snout, and it is the bane of the cellarer's existence. These insects do not just eat the grain, they live inside it. The female bores a hole into a kernel, lays an egg, and seals it up. The larva eats the inside of the seed, hollowing it out, leaving only a shell. A bin that looks full can actually be a ghost town of empty husks. When the grain is ground into flour in the monastery mill, the weevils are ground with it. This leads to a gritty, unspoken truth of monastic diet. The bread is often higher in protein than the recipe intends. The monks are eating the beetles. In times of plenty, the flour is sifted through fine cloth to remove the larger parts of the insects, but the eggs and the larvae pass through. In times of famine, nothing is sifted. The bread is dark, heavy, and speckled with the remnants of the pests. It is a biological recycling that the monks accept with resignation. But the weevil is a gentleman compared to the rat. We hear them before we see them, a scratching, scuttling sound in the rafters. The stone walls of the undercroft are thick, but the rat is a master engineer. They gnaw through wood, they squeeze through drainage pipes, they tunnel under foundations. They are the shadow citizens of the abbey. The cellarer employs cats, yes, and sometimes terriers, but the sheer volume of food attracts a population that cannot be fully controlled. The rats urinate on the sacks. They defecate in the corners. They carry the fleas we met in the dormitory. The cellarer must constantly rotate the stock, moving the older sacks to the front, checking for the telltale holes, the smell of ammonia. It is a filthy job. He spends his days covered in a fine grey dust, a mixture of flour, mold spores, and dried rodent droppings that coats his lungs and gives him a chronic hacking cough known as miller's lung. Then there is the horror of the rye. Among the sacks of grain, there lurks a danger far worse than weevils. Occasionally, a black, spur-shaped fungus grows on the rye in the damp fields. It is Claviceps purpurea, known to history as ergot, if the cellarer is careless, or if the harvest was wet and the need for food is desperate. The infected rye is ground into flour. The bread baked from this flour carries a potent toxin, a natural relative of LSD. The result is a terrifying illness called St. Anthony's fire. Imagine a winter evening where half the monastery begins to complain of burning sensations in their limbs, as if their invisible veins are filled with fire. Then come the hallucinations, visions of devils, angels, or terrifying monsters. In severe cases, the blood vessels constrict so tightly that gangrene sets in, and fingers or toes turn black and simply fall off. To the medieval mind, this is not a fungal poisoning. It is a divine curse, a demonic possession. The cellarer, unwittingly, has poisoned his brothers with the daily bread. Historians now believe that many outbreaks of mass hysteria or religious visions in monasteries were actually mass ergotism events, born from the filth of the grain supply. We move deeper into the cold storage, past the grain, to the barrels of fish. Since meat is restricted, the monastery runs on fish. But fresh fish is for the abbot's table. For the rank and file, there is stockfish, cod or ling, that has been air-dried until it is as hard as a plank of wood. It is stacked like lumber against the wall. The smell is pungent, a concentrated essence of the ocean that has turned slightly rancid. To make it edible, the kitchen staff must beat it with hammers for an hour, and then soak it for days in water and lye, wood ash solution, to soften it. It is tough, fibrous, and salty. The preservation method works, but it turns the food into a test of jaw strength. There is also the garderobe of food, the pantry where the leftovers are kept. Here, the line between thrift and hygiene blurs. Medieval monks are forbidden to waste God's crumbs. So the cheese that has gone green with mold is not thrown away. The mold is scraped off, and the cheese is served. The apple that is rotting on one side is cut, and the good half is saved. The ale that has gone sour becomes vinegar. This frugality is virtuous, but it means the monks are constantly consuming food that is on the very edge of spoilage. Their gut biomes are likely incredibly robust, forged in the fires of mild food poisoning. The cellarer himself is a figure of complex morality. He controls the flow of resources. He decides who gets the fresh butter and who gets the rancid oil. He deals with the outside world, trading wool for wine and honey for wax. This contact with money and markets often makes him the target of suspicion. In the satire of the time, the cellarer is often portrayed as fat, hiding a ham under his bed, or skimming off the best wine for his private stash. While many were honest men crushed by the stress of feeding hundreds, the temptation was always there. The filth of the cellar is not just dust and rats. It is the filth of commerce, the handling of dirty coins that have passed through the hands of sinners. Scholarship on monastic diet has revealed a fascinating debate. Were the monks malnourished or overfed? The skeletons found in monastic graveyards often tell a confusing story. They show signs of diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, a condition often linked to obesity and a rich diet, the monastic disease. Yet they also show signs of vitamin deficiencies and chronic dental abscesses from the gritty bread. It seems they were often calories-rich but nutrient-poor, stuffed with bread and ale, but starving for fresh vitamins. They were heavy, yet their gums were bleeding. As we stand in the corner of the undercroft, watching the cellarer inspect a barrel of salted pork, checking for the maggots that inevitably find their way into the brine, we feel the oppressive weight of this responsibility. The survival of the community hangs on this room. If the rats win, the monks starve. If the damp gets in, the mold wins. It is a high-stakes gamble played in the dark. The cellarer sighs, locks the heavy oak door, and leaves us in the gloom. The temperature here is stable, but as we follow him out, moving away from the insulated safety of the earth-banked storerooms, we are about to encounter a different kind of cold. We are heading into the heart of the monastic night, where the architecture itself turns against the men it shelters, and the simple act of sitting still becomes a form of torture. We leave the heavy, earthy scent of the grain stores and step out into the cloister garth, and instantly the reality of the season hits us. It is winter, perhaps the deep, biting winter of 1309, a year when the Thames froze solid, and the sun has long since dipped below the horizon. The monastery at night is a different beast than the monastery by day. The darkness is absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that swallows the stone arches, broken only by the feeble, sputtering light of a few tallow lanterns. But it is not the dark that frightens the monks. It is the cold. We are entering the chill of Compline, the final hour of the day, where the battle against the elements is fought not with fire, but with stillness. To understand the thermal reality of a medieval abbey, you must strip away every modern concept of heating. There is no central heating, no insulation, no double glazing. The walls are 3 feet of solid limestone. In the summer, this thermal mass is a blessing, keeping the air cool and stable. But in the winter, the stone acts as a massive battery of cold. It absorbs the freezing temperatures of the night and radiates them back into the rooms during the day. The interior of the church is often colder than the air outside, a stone refrigerator that preserves the chill long after a brief thaw. Before the final prayers, there is one sanctuary, one tiny island of mercy in this ocean of ice, the calefactorium, or the warming room. It is usually located under the dormitory or near the refectory. We step inside and the relief is physical, almost painful. This is the only room in the entire monastery, besides the kitchen and infirmary, where a fire is allowed. The air here is thick, smelling of wet wool, drying, wood smoke, and crowded bodies. The monks are allowed to gather here for brief intervals to thaw their veins. Watch them. They do not sit around the fire telling stories like travelers in a tavern. They stand in silence or speak in low murmurs, rotating slowly like meat on a spit so that front and back get equal heat. They hold out their hands, fingers red and swollen, trying to work the stiffness out of their knuckles before they must handle the heavy pages of the choir books. But the bell rings. The respite is over. It is time for Compline. The monks file out of the warm, smoky womb of the calefactory and back into the biting draught of the cloister. The shock to the system is brutal. The sweat that formed under their heavy wool habits in the warming room instantly begins to cool, turning their clothes into clammy, cold compresses against their skin. They march in a line, heads down, breaths pluming in the air like dragon smoke. They are heading to the church, the coldest place of all. The abbey church at night is a cavern of shadows. The vaulted ceiling disappears into blackness. The only light comes from the few candles near the altar and the choir stalls. The temperature here can drop below freezing. Holy water stopes have been known to freeze solid, requiring the sacristan to break the ice with a hammer before Mass. A sharp, cracking sound that echoes through the silence. The monks take their places in the wooden stalls. Compline is a beautiful contemplative service, intended to settle the spirit before sleep. But physically, it is an endurance test. They must stand or kneel on the cold stone flags for nearly an hour. Here we encounter a scholarly debate regarding the Little Ice Age. Historians and climatologists note that starting around the early 14th century, Europe entered a period of cooling. Winters became longer, wetter, and more brutal. For a community committed to a rule written in the warmer climate of 6th century Italy, this climactic shift was a disaster. The rule of Saint Benedict was not designed for the freezing fens of Lincolnshire or the snowy peaks of Bavaria. We see the monks struggling to adapt. They wear night boots of felt or fur in the choir to prevent their toes from turning black. They pull their hoods deep over their faces. But the cold finds a way. The filth of the cold is subtle but pervasive. It is the filth of the runny nose. In a freezing church, the nose runs as a physiological defense mechanism to warm the air before it hits the lungs. 100 men standing in silence, all battling the drip of mucus. There are no tissues. There are no handkerchiefs, officially. The sleeve of the habit becomes the catch-all. The cuffs of the robes are often stiff with dried mucus. It is a gross, human reality that stains the dignity of the liturgy. You might hear the wet sniffling of the choir, a counter-melody to the Gregorian chant that no musicologist records. Then there is the pain of perniosis or chilblains. This is a medical condition caused by the repeated exposure of skin to cold and damp, followed by rapid warming, like rushing from the church to the warming room. The small blood vessels in the skin inflame, causing red, itchy, burning swellings on the fingers, toes, and ears. Look at the hands of the monk holding the antiphon, the book of chants. His knuckles are swollen, shiny and red, perhaps cracked and bleeding. Every time he turns a parchment page, the dry skin splits a little more. The itch is maddening, a burning fire under the skin that cannot be scratched away. It is a martyrdom of the extremities. The cold also kills hygiene. We spoke earlier of the reluctance to bathe, but in winter, washing even the hands and face becomes an act of extreme willpower. The water in the lavatorium troughs is painfully cold, sometimes possessing a skim of ice. Monks skip the wash. Who can blame them? Layers of dirt and sweat are allowed to accumulate because the alternative is hypothermia. The skin becomes dry, scaly, and gray. The odor of sanctity in winter is less about sweat and more about stale, unwashed wool, and the musty smell of damp clothes that never truly dry. There is a dark humor in the innovative ways monks try to cheat the cold. Archaeology has uncovered boom warmers, hollow metal balls, beautifully filigreed, which could be filled with hot coals or hot oil. These were technically for the priest celebrating Mass, to keep his fingers dexterous enough to handle the host without dropping it, a grave sin. But one can imagine a senior monk, perhaps the prior, smuggling a hot stone wrapped in a cloth into the choir stall, tucking it into his wide sleeve, a secret furnace, while his brothers shiver. The monastery cat, if there is one, has no such shame. It is likely curled up on the abbot's cushion, the smartest creature in the room. The service of Compline ends with the Salve Regina, sung in the dark. The sound is hauntingly beautiful, the voices blending in the icy acoustics. The cold air makes the acoustics sharper, clearer, but as the last note fades, the silence that follows is heavy. The abbot sprinkles the brothers with holy water, which feels like liquid ice, and gives the signal for bed. The day is done, but the cold is not. We follow the procession up the night stairs to the dormitory. This is perhaps the hardest transition. The warming room is closed. The fire is banked. The dormitory is unheated. The monks must now strip off their outer layer, the cowl, and climb into beds that feel like slabs of frozen meat. The straw mattresses have absorbed the ambient moisture of the foggy river valley. They are damp. To get into bed is to sandwich oneself between two layers of cold, The monks sleep in their clothes, as we know, and in winter they pile on every scrap of fabric allowed. Some orders permit a coverlet of sheepskin or heavy wool. They pull the covers over their heads, creating a tent to trap their breath. The dormitory becomes a chorus of coughing. The cold air irritates the lungs. The winter cough is a permanent resident of the room, echoing through the rafters. Sleep is shallow and restless. The body burns calories frantically just to keep the core temperature up, leading to a deep, exhausting hunger that greets them in the morning. As we stand in the center of the dark dormitory, listening to the chattering teeth and the rustle of straw, we realize that the cold is more than just a temperature. It is a presence. It is a weight that sits on the chest. It creates a kind of collective depression, a seasonal melancholy, where the soul feels frozen along with the ground. The spring seems impossibly far away. The winter night is long, and in just a few hours, the bell will ring for matins, dragging them back out of their warm nests and into the stone icebox of the church to start the cycle all over again. But before the sun rises, while the monks are locked in their icy dreams, another kind of work has been happening, a work that requires light, precision, and a different kind of physical suffering. We must go back down the stairs, past the sleeping bodies, and find the one room where the lights burn longest, where the filth is made of ink and chemicals, and where the preservation of knowledge demands a heavy price from the body. We leave the frozen silence of the dormitory and the echoing coughs of the sleepers to descend a narrow spiral staircase. We are heading towards the north walk of the cloister, or perhaps a dedicated room above the chapter house, to a place that history has romanticized more than any other, the scriptorium. In our minds, this is a place of serene beauty, where golden light streams through stained glass onto the pages of a masterpiece. But as we push open the door, the reality hits us in the nose. The air here does not smell of old books and wisdom. It smells of a tannery mixed with a chemical laboratory. It reeks of rotting organic matter, sharp vinegar, boiled glue, and the metallic tang of copper and iron. This is not a study. It is a factory, and the product being manufactured is the Word of God, built from the rawest materials of nature. The first thing to understand is the paper. It does not exist. The monks are writing on parchment or vellum, which is quite literally the scraped and stretched skin of a dead animal. To make a single Bible might require the skins of 300 sheep or calves. The preparation of this material is a filthy, bloody business, often relegated to lay brothers or the lower ranks. The skins are soaked in vellum-making pits filled with lime and urine. Yes, urine again, for its ammonia, to loosen the hair. Then comes the scraping. Imagine the sound, the lunulum, a crescent-shaped knife rasping endlessly against the wet, rubbery skin stretched on a wooden frame. The goal is to scrape away every trace of flesh, fat, and hair, leaving a surface that is smooth and white. But if you look closely at a medieval manuscript, you can sometimes see the ghost of the animal, the pattern of the hair follicles, a scar from a barbed wire fence or a bramble, or even a vein that the knife missed. The holy text is tattooed onto a corpse. Now, look at the ink. It is not the bottled synthetic ink of today. It is iron gall ink, a potion brewed by the monks themselves. Its creation is a lesson in medieval chemistry and biology. It begins with the oak gall, a hard, round growth found on oak trees. These are not fruit. They are the result of a parasitic wasp laying its eggs in the tree bud. The tree reacts by forming a tumor-like ball rich in tannic acid. The monks gather these wasp tumors, crush them, and boil them in rainwater or wine. To this, they add vitriol, iron sulfate, and gum arabic from acacia trees. When the iron meets the tannin, the liquid turns a deep, ferocious black. But this ink is alive. It is acidic. Over centuries, it slowly eats into the parchment. In some ancient manuscripts, the letters have burned right through the skin, leaving lace-like holes where the words used to be. The word of the scribe literally consumes the page. The colors for the illuminations, the beautiful swirling borders, and capital letters come from even stranger sources. The filthy truth of medieval art is that beauty is often poison. The brilliant red vermilion comes from crushing cinnabar, a mercury ore that drives men mad. The bright yellow orpiment contains arsenic. The lead white used for highlights is toxic. To lick the brush, a common habit for artists to get a fine point, is to slowly poison oneself. And then there are the organic pigments. Earwax yellow is exactly what it sounds like. Earwax mixed with glare, egg white. Mosaic gold is made from tin and sulfur. The stunning lapis lazuli blue is crushed rock from Afghanistan, more expensive than gold. But the binders used to stick it to the page are made from fish glue or boiled rabbit skins. The page is a chemical minefield, but the physical toll of the writing itself is the true hidden history. We see a monk, brother scribe, sitting at his slanted desk. The room is silent, but his body is screaming. Writing in the Middle Ages is not a wrist movement. It is a whole body exercise. 3 fingers hold the pen. An old monastic riddle goes, but the whole body labors. The monk must hold the heavy quill at a precise angle. He does not rest his hand on the page, for the grease from his skin would ruin the vellum, preventing the ink from sticking. So his arm hovers, unsupported, for hours. The muscle tension travels up the arm, locking the shoulder, twisting the spine. Look at his back. He is hunched over, his nose inches from the page. Monks often developed a permanent curvature of the spine, a scholar's hunch. The eye strain is catastrophic. In a world before corrective lenses, spectacles were invented in Italy around the late 13th century, but were rare. A scribe with failing eyesight was a tragedy. He might be demoted to mixing paints or ruling lines. The scriptorium is dim. Candles are expensive and dangerous. Fire is the great fear, so they rely on natural light. In winter, the light fails by 3 p.m. They work in a twilight gloom, squinting until their heads throb. The sheer mechanical effort of scratching a quill against resistant animal skin is immense. It is more like engraving than writing. 6 hours of this is physically equivalent to a day of breaking rocks. And they hated it. This is the most humanizing revelation of the scriptorium. We imagine them in a state of pious flow. But the margins of the manuscripts tell a different story. These are the colophons, the notes scribbled by monks at the end of a long day or a finished book. They are the tweets of the 12th century, and they are full of complaints. The ink is thin. The parchment is hairy. My back hurts. Thank God, it will soon be dark. Saint Patrick of Armagh, deliver me from this writing. This page was written by a sleepy monk. One famous marginal note simply says, "Now I have written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. These are not the words of serene saints. They are the words of bored, exhausted workers doing a grueling job. The discipline in the scriptorium is ironclad. Mistakes are sins. If a monk misspells a word in the Bible, is he corrupting the word of God? The devil Titivilus was a mythological demon said to collect all the dropped syllables and mumbled prayers of the monks, stuffing them into a sack to use as evidence against them at the Last Judgment. He also prowled the scriptorium, nudging elbows to cause typos. To correct a mistake, the monk cannot use an eraser. He must take a razor and scrape the ink off the skin, rasura, thinning the page and leaving a rough patch. A manuscript full of scrape marks is a record of human failure. Yet despite the pain, the toxins, and the boredom, what they create is miraculous. We watch Brother Scribe finish a capital Q. He lays down a layer of gesso, a plaster mix, and breathes on it to moisten it. Then he takes a small sheet of gold leaf, thinner than breath, and lays it down. He burnishes it with a dog's tooth or a polished agate until it shines like a mirror. This illumination is meant to reflect the light of God, but practically, it reflects the candlelight lighting up the page in the dark church. It is a technology of light. The scriptorium is also a place of silence, but it is a noisy silence. The scratching of 20 quills on skin sounds like the scurrying of mice, the sound of a knife scraping a mistake, the groan of a shifting wooden stool, the heavy sigh of a man whose hand has cramped into a claw. It is a sweatshop of the soul. These men are preserving the knowledge of the ancient world, Aristotle, Plato, the Gospels, but they are doing it with aching bodies and stained fingers, surrounded by the smell of dead sheep and oak galls. Historians often debate how literate these monks actually were. It is a filthy truth that not every monk in the scriptorium could read what he was copying. Some were merely copying shapes, trusting that the strokes meant something holy. They were human photocopiers, reproducing texts they didn't understand. But the masters, the true illuminators, were artists of the highest caliber, channeling their frustration and their genius into microscopic worlds of color. As we leave the scriptorium, stepping carefully over a spilled pot of red lead, we leave behind the men who turn pain into beauty. They will sit there until the light fails, their spines curving, their eyes dimming, sacrificing their bodies to build the library of the future. But the day is ending for everyone. The bell for Vespers has rung and gone. The monastery is winding down. We must move to the one place where the community gathers not to work or to pray, but to simply be together, the place where the silence is finally allowed to break, if only for a whisper, and where the human need for connection fights against the rule of solitude. The final notes of the Salve Regina have faded into the stone walls of the church, and the community moves as one dark, silent organism toward the night stairs. We follow them up the worn stone steps, the friction of leather sandals on grit the only sound, ascending into the most intimate and paradoxical space in the monastery, the dormitory or daughter. We expect this to be a place of rest, a sanctuary of peace where the weary body can finally let go. But as we step into the long, vaulted hall that runs the length of the cloister, we realize that peace here is a relative term. The dormitory is not a place of solitude. It is a warehouse of sleep, a gallery of unconscious vulnerability, where the filthy truth of human biology continues its noisy, restless work throughout the night. The room is immense, a shadowy tunnel stretching into the gloom, lined on both sides with pallet beds. In the earlier centuries of monasticism, there were no partitions. It was an open plan, a barracks of holiness. Later, as the desire for privacy grew, wooden screens or curtains were added to create small cubicles. But the acoustic reality remained unchanged. A curtain cannot block sound. A wooden screen cannot filter smell. We are standing in a room with 50, perhaps 100 men, all lying down to sleep simultaneously. The air is thick, recycled, and warm, a stark contrast to the freezing church below. It smells of straw, of unwashed wool, of the oil in the night lamps, and undeniably, of the collective breath of the brotherhood. The monks do not undress. The rule is strict. They must sleep girded, wearing their habits and belts, ready to spring up at a moment's notice for the second coming or the midnight office, whichever comes first. Imagine the physical sensation. You are tired. Your bones ache from the scriptorium or the fields, but you cannot loosen your belt. The knife at your side, used for eating and work, must be removed, lest you injure yourself in a dream. But the heavy wool remains. It bunches up. It scratches. It twists around your legs as you turn. There is no cool side of the pillow here. The pillow is often a log covered in cloth or a hard bolster of straw that smells of the barn. And then the symphony begins. It starts slowly. A soft whistle from an elderly brother near the door. Then a deep, rhythmic rumble from the cellarer, whose chest is heavy. Soon the room is filled with a cacophony of snores, wheezes, and snorts. For a monk suffering from insomnia, a condition the medievals called vigilia, this room is a torture chamber. There is no escape from the noise. It is a biological choir that never stops. We hear the grinding of teeth, the muttering of a dreamer fighting a demon in his sleep, and the sudden, startling cough of the consumptive brother we saw in the infirmary, who has been sent back to the daughter because he is stable. The concept of a good night's sleep is a modern invention. Here, sleep is a communal activity, a shared endurance of the night. But they are not unwatched. Walk softly down the center aisle with me. Do you see the figure moving silently with a lantern, casting long swinging shadows against the ceiling? This is the Circator, the round walker. He is a senior monk assigned the thankless task of patrolling the dormitory while others sleep. His job is to ensure that no brother has fallen into immodesty, kicking off his covers to expose his legs, or worse, is engaging in private conversation. The Circator is the eye of the abbot, the eye of God, prowling in the dark. He listens for whispers. He watches for the subtle movements that might suggest sin. It is a surveillance state, even in slumber. A monk cannot even dream without the fear that his tossing and turning is being noted in a ledger of discipline. Historians and sociologists often analyze the psychological pressure of this lack of privacy, to never be alone, not even for a minute, not even in the dark. The great silence that reigns from Compline to Prime is a legal silence, not a literal one. The room is alive with the sounds of digestion, the wind of the beans we saw in the kitchen, and the shifting of straw. The proximity is suffocating. If the brother in the next bed has a nightmare and screams, everyone wakes up. If the brother across the aisle has the flux and must rush to the reader daughter 10 times a night, everyone hears the slap of his feet and the creak of the door. And yet, the night is not one long block of sleep. This is the era of biphasic sleep. The monks go to bed around 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock p.m., exhausted. They sleep deeply for perhaps 4 hours. The first sleep. Then a bell rings, a harsh clanging intrusion that shatters the dream. It is midnight, or perhaps 2 a.m. It is time for matins, the night office. This is the hardest moment of the monastic life. The body is warm, the mind is foggy, the biological clock screams to stay in bed, but the will must obey the bell. Watch them rise. It is a scene of groggy confusion. They stumble out of their pallets, shaking the straw from their habits. There is no time to wash, no coffee to wake the brain. They are sleep drunks, shuffling toward the stairs. They must navigate the dark dormitory without tripping, finding their place in the line by instinct. This interruption of the natural sleep cycle is deliberate. It is meant to break the hold of the flesh. But medically, it creates a state of chronic sleep deprivation. The monks are perpetually tired. Their immune systems are weakened. Their tempers are short. The anxiety, the spiritual vice of listlessness or despair that haunts so many monasteries, is likely, in modern terms, a symptom of chronic exhaustion. While the main body of monks descends to the church for an hour of chanting in the dark, let us stay behind in the dormitory for a moment. It is not empty. The sick and the very old are sometimes excused. We hear the quiet groans of an arthritis-ridden elder trying to find a comfortable position on his hard mattress. In the silence left by the departed choir, the loneliness of the dormitory amplifies. This is the time when the demons of the mind attack. Medieval texts are full of accounts of monks seeing apparitions in the dormitory, black dogs, small imps sitting on chests, or seductive visions of the lives they left behind. In the dark, deprived of sleep and food, the brain hallucinates. The line between spiritual vision and neurological misfire blurs. When the monks return from matins, around 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., and they are allowed a second sleep until dawn. But this sleep is fitful. They are cold from the church. Their adrenaline is up. They lie down, shivering, trying to recapture the warmth they lost. It is a cruel rhythm. Just as they drift off again, the bell for lauds, the dawn prayer, will ring. The night is not a time of rest. It is a time of work, fragmented and monitored. There is a scholarly debate about the sin of the night. Monastic penitentials, books listing sins and their punishments, are obsessed with nocturnal emissions. If a monk has a wet dream, is it a sin? Is it a sign of a corrupt mind, or just a rebellious body? The anxiety surrounding this is palpable. A monk might wake up in shame, terrified to confess, yet terrified to take communion if he doesn't. He lies in the dark, analyzing his own unconscious thoughts, wondering if a demon visited him. The bed, which should be a place of comfort, becomes a battlefield of moral theology. As we stand by the window of the dormitory, looking out at the moonlit cloister below, the room behind us settles back into its rhythm of snores and rustles. The air is heavy with the humidity of 50 exhaling lungs. We can almost taste the fatigue. It is a tangible weight. These men are soldiers of prayer, and this room is their barracks. They have surrendered everything: their will, their possessions, their bodies, and even their sleep, to the order. The filth here is the filth of exhaustion, of bodies pushed to their biological limits in the name of the spirit. But the night does not last forever. The window is turning a shade of grey. The rooster in the outer courtyard is stirring. The second sleep is ending. The cycle of the day is about to begin again. But before we leave the sleeping brothers to their final moments of rest, we must acknowledge a different kind of wearing down. We have seen the toll on their skin, their stomachs, and their minds. Now we must look at the specific, intentional pain they inflict upon themselves. We move from the accidental discomfort of the straw mattress to the deliberate agony of the secret garment, delving into the mindset that believes pain is the only true soap for the soul. We step away from the collective breathing of the dormitory, finding a quiet corner in the early grey light of dawn where a monk is making a private adjustment to his attire. We have witnessed the passive suffering of the brotherhood, the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the crawling lice, and the scratching wool. These are the burdens nature and architecture place upon them. But for some, the filthy truth of monastic life goes deeper. It is not enough to endure the pain that God sends. One must invite more. We are now entering the realm of the silicium, the hair shirt, where the filth is not an accident of hygiene, but a weapon of the will. The garment this brother is tightening around his chest is not made of sheep's wool. It is woven from the coarse, spiky hair of goats, specifically the goats of Cilicia in modern Turkey, known for their brutal, wire-like fleece. Run your mental fingers over the fabric. It is not cloth. It is a scourging mat. It is designed to irritate. The fibers are stiff, sharp, and prone to splintering. When worn directly against the skin, underneath the linen shirt, underneath the wool habit, hidden from the eyes of the abbot and the world, it acts as 1,000 tiny needles. Every breath, every bend of the waist, every lift of the arm drives the goat hair into the pores. The logic behind this self-inflicted torture is alien to the modern mind, which spends billions annually on comfort, painkillers, and soft fabrics. But in the medieval equation of the soul, the body is a rebellious donkey that must be tamed. If the flesh is comfortable, the spirit sleeps. If the flesh is screaming, the spirit is awake, alert, and clinging to the cross. The hair shirt is a constant, biting reminder of the suffering of Christ. It turns the entire day into a silent prayer of endurance. But the biological reality of the silicium is far grimmer than the spiritual ideal. The skin, subjected to constant friction and puncture, begins to break down. The filthy truth here is infection. The goat hair is not sterile. It is an animal product that traps sweat, dead skin, and dirt against the open abrasions it creates. We see the skin beneath the shirt turning red, then raw, then weeping. In the heat of summer, the area under the hair shirt becomes a festering swamp of bacteria. Boils and carbuncles are common. The monk does not treat them, he welcomes them. The pus and the pain are proofs of his devotion. He is literally rotting his own flesh to save his soul. There is a historical debate regarding how widespread this practice was. Was every monk wearing one? Likely not. It was often reserved for the most zealous, or those doing penance for specific sins. But it was a status symbol of the invisible kind. In the competitive hierarchy of holiness, the monk who walked with a slight limp or a stiff back because of his secret silice was viewed with awe. It was a machismo of the martyrs. We have records of monks who wore them for so long that the hair shirt effectively became a skin graft. When they finally died and the brothers came to wash the body, they found the garment embedded in the scabs and scar tissue. To remove it was to rip the skin away with it. The fabric and the man had fused into one knotted, bloody entity, but the hair shirt is only the beginning. In the privacy of the chapter house, or sometimes in the solitude of the cell, we encounter the discipline, the whip. This is the flagellum. It is usually a small scourge made of knotted cords, leather strips, or sometimes, for the truly committed, chains with small metal stars. The practice of self-flagellation, the discipline, was not a daily activity for all, but it was a regular part of the penitential cycle. A monk would strip to the waist, kneel, and strike his own back while reciting the Miserere, Psalm 51. The sound is distinct. The wet slap of leather on skin, the sharp intake of breath, the low murmur of the Latin verse. Miserere me, Deus. Have mercy on me, O God. The goal was not to cause permanent injury, but to mortify the flesh, literally, to make it dead, to bruise the ego along with the back. But in a community living in filth, opening up the skin on one's back is a dangerous game. The whip, hanging on a nail in the cell, collects dust and bacteria. The wounds on the back are hard to reach and harder to clean. They become hot, angry lines of infection. A monk might spend weeks in a feverish haze, fighting the sepsis he invited into his own bloodstream, convinced that the fever is the fire of the Holy Spirit, purging him of sin. We must also consider the filthy psychological toll of this. It creates a relationship with the body that is based entirely on hatred. The body is the enemy. It is the thing that wants to sleep, to eat, to lust. Therefore, it must be punished. This leads to a kind of holy dysmorphia. The uglier the body becomes, scarred, unwashed, rash-ridden, the more beautiful the soul is imagined to be. It is a reversal of all natural instincts. We see a young brother, perhaps only 20, looking in a polished metal basin at his reflection. He sees a sore on his lip and smiles, not out of vanity, but out of satisfaction. The decay has begun. He is winning the war against his own youth. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but illustrating the point, of a monk who found a louse on his hair shirt. Instead of crushing it, he carefully picked it up and placed it back on his neck, saying, "Why should I deny you your feast, little brother? You are created by God to humble me." This level of submission to filth is radical. It borders on madness to the secular eye, but to the mystic, it is the ultimate freedom. If you can love the louse, if you can love the itch, if you can love the pain, then the world has no power over you. You are untouchable, because you have already embraced the worst it can do. However, the hair shirt has another, unintended consequence. It smells. Goat hair, when wet with sweat and heated by the body, releases a pungent, musky odor that is distinct from the human smell. It is the smell of the barnyard. A monk wearing a cilice carries a cloud of goat around him. In the crowded choir, his neighbors know. They smell the sacrifice. It creates a subtle tension. Is Brother John wearing the shirt because he is holy, or because he wants us to know he is holy? The filth of spiritual pride sneaks in even here, amidst the sores and the stink. The shirt also destroys the clothes worn over it. The coarse hair acts like sandpaper, rubbing through the linen undertunic and eventually wearing thin spots in the wool habit itself. The laundry brothers know who is wearing the cilice. They see the bloodstains on the undergarments. They see the shredded fabric. It is an open secret. The monastery, for all its rules of silence, is a place where the body talks loudly. The limp, the scratch, the smell, the stain. These are the languages of the hidden life. As we watch the monk finish his adjustment, wincing slightly as the knots settle into a fresh bruise, we realize that he is preparing for the final stage of his journey. The body can only take so much. The cold, the bad food, the bleeding, the lack of sleep, and now the active destruction of the skin. It all accumulates. The machine starts to break down. The filth of life eventually overwhelms the spark of vitality. The hair shirt is, in a way, a rehearsal for the grave. It is a shroud worn by the living. And so the inevitable happens. The bell tolls not for prayer, but for passing. The monk we have followed, the one shivering in the choir, scratching in the scriptorium, and bleeding in the infirmary, finally collapses. The struggle is over. The biology of the monastery has won. But even in death, the filthy truth continues. The medieval approach to the corpse and the grave is not sanitized or hidden away. It is raw, it is communal, and it is deeply connected to the earth. We must take one last walk, following the procession out of the church doors and into the garden of bones, where the final transformation from monk to dust takes place. The bell tolling for the dead has a different timbre than the bell for prayer. It is slower, deeper, a heavy metallic heartbeat that vibrates through the soles of the feet of every man in the monastery. We follow the brothers, now on their final procession, carrying the body of our weary traveler, the monk who has endured the cold, the hunger, the lice, and the labor, out of the church and into the monastery graveyard. This is the last chapter of the filthy truth, where the body, which was so carefully mortified in life, is finally surrendered to the ultimate recycling of nature. The preparation for this moment was simple and stark. Upon his last breath, the monk's body was washed, perhaps the most thorough washing he had received in decades. It is a final act of tenderness by the community. Then he was not dressed in a suit or placed in a silk-lined box. He was sewn into his habit. The very wool that scratched him in life now becomes his shroud. In many orders, the hood is sewn shut over the face, erasing his individuality forever. He has become a faceless package of holy matter. We step out into the garth, the open ground often located within the cloister, or just beyond the east end of the church. The earth here is bumpy, uneven, and thick with grass. It is a sown field, but the crop is human bone. Here lies the final gritty reality of monastic estate management. Space is limited. The monastery has stood here for 300 years. Hundreds of monks have lived and died, but the graveyard has not grown. It is a finite container for an infinite stream of mortality. This leads to the practical, if macabre, custom of the translated grave. When the gravedigger, often a sturdy lay brother with a spade and a strong stomach, digs the hole for our newly departed friend, he rarely hits virgin soil. Instead, his shovel strikes something hard, a thigh bone, a rib cage, a skull. These are the remains of a brother who died perhaps 50 years ago. In the medieval mind, this is not a desecration, it is a rotation. The flesh of the old monk has long since returned to dust, green earth that is tossed up onto the bank. The bones, clean and dry, are carefully collected. They are not thrown away. They are moved to the charnel house or ossuary, a crypt or shed often located near the cemetery gate. If we were to peek inside, we would see them, stacks of femurs piled like firewood, pyramids of skulls grinning in the dark. It is a library of the dead. There is no horror here for the monks, only a calm acceptance of the cycle of dust. The old brother makes way for the new. It is a final act of community, sharing the very earth they sleep in, just as they shared the dormitory. Our monk is lowered into the hole, perhaps directly onto the earth, without a coffin. Wood is expensive and needed for building. The earth is free. He is laid to rest on the bones of his predecessors, physically joining the history of the order. The service is chanted, the In Paradisum. May the angels lead you into paradise. The sound is beautiful, drifting up into the grey sky. But look down at the grave. The soil being shoveled back in is dark, rich, and worm-filled. It is the most fertile soil in the district. This brings us to a quiet biological truth. The monastery garden, where the vegetables and herbs grow, is often adjacent to, or even downhill from, the graveyard. The nutrients of the dead, the nitrogen, the calcium, leach into the soil. The cabbages that feed the living monks are, in a very real scientific sense, nourished by the dust of the dead monks. It is a closed loop. The filth of the corpse becomes the fuel of the kitchen. The brothers are literally consuming their history, sustained by the generations that came before them. There is a scholarly discussion regarding the health implications of these crowded burials. In times of plague, when the Black Death sweeps through the abbey, the system breaks down. The graves are dug too shallow. The turnover is too fast. The stench of death that chronicles describe is not a metaphor. It is the smell of a graveyard that cannot digest the bodies fast enough. In these moments, the filthytruth becomes a lethal hazard, poisoning the wells and the air, turning the sanctuary into a death trap. But in normal times, the earth does its work efficiently. As the grave is filled and the turf replaced, a simple wooden cross, or perhaps no marker at all, is placed at the head. The monk's name is written in the necrology, the Book of the Dead, to be prayed for on his anniversary. But physically, he disappears. There is no grandiose marble tomb for the rank and file. He sinks back into the anonymity of the ground. Stand here for a moment as the other monks file back into the cloister for their next duty. The silence returns to the graveyard. The wind rustles the yew trees, ancient trees often planted in churchyards because their roots were thought to purify the soil of the dead. The filth we have explored, the unwashed skin, the smoky kitchens, the latrines over the river, the dusty libraries, the crawling lice, all of it ends here, in this quiet, damp patch of earth. Was it a life of misery? To the modern eye, obsessed with hygiene and comfort, perhaps, it was a life of relentless physical challenge, surrounded by dirt and decay. But looking at the peace of this final resting place, we might see it differently. They did not try to escape the filth of the world by building a sterile bubble. They waded into it. They accepted that to be human is to be messy, to leak, to smell, to rot. They tried to build a ladder to heaven out of mud and stone. The filth was the friction against which they sharpened their souls. The cold made the prayer warmer. The hunger made the bread holier. The lice made the patience deeper. The dirt was the constant reminder that they were not angels yet. And now, as the rain begins to fall softly on the fresh earth, washing the dust from the grass, the struggle is over. The dirt has finally claimed them, not as a punishment, but as a mother claiming a child. The monk is no longer dirty. He is simply earth. He has returned to the raw material of creation, waiting in the dark and the quiet for whatever comes next. The bell stops tolling. The birds begin to sing. The cycle continues. The heavy oak gates of the abbey are slowly swinging shut now, sealing the history inside. The chanting of the monks fades into a soft, rhythmic hum, blending with the sound of the rain falling on the ancient stone roof. The candle in the scriptorium flickers and goes out, leaving only the scent of beeswax and the comforting dark. We have walked through the mud, the smoke, and the shadows of the past. But now it is time to step back into the warmth and safety of your own night. Let the images of the stone walls and the grey mist dissolve. Feel the softness of your own bed, the clean, cool air around you, and the heaviness of your own resting body sinking into relaxation. The history is done. The work is finished. There is nothing left to do but drift. The river flows on, the earth sleeps, and so can you. Sweet dreams.